Hello and greetings. This is Train Time, the podcast, and it really is train time, even here in the United States. I'm Karen Christensen, and I started the Train Campaign, a project of the Barrington Institute, in 2011. I began recording interviews with politicians and train activists in 2017, most in the U.S., but sometimes looking to projects in other parts of the world. I hope you'll subscribe to Train Time and also send me your questions and suggestions. And visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage. Good morning, Gareth. It's absolutely fabulous to talk to you. Now tell me where you're in the UK. But
yes,
where
I am. I'm in Old York. So the thing that New York was named after and everyone's forgotten, Old York. It's a nice old historic city. It's very medieval and crumbly. But the weather's gorgeous outside, actually. It's lovely. I'm British, so obviously the second thing I have to talk about is the weather. The third thing is,
Absolutely.
The third thing is trains. So, that's it.
I've taken the train to York a number of times. I have friends there, so I know.
Oh, lovely.
Fast,
Yeah, the train.
It's a fast train.
Yeah, I was going to say among the highest average speeds for long distance travel in Europe, even though it's on existing tracks and that causes all of its own problems. But yeah, you pretty much get 100 mile an hour average speed, like average speed 100, and the top speed you'll sit at 125 for a lot of that journey down to London and back. So hour 45 from York to London. It's pretty good going. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a decent distance.
Yeah, it's great. So just to explain to listeners, I was looking for, I started the podcast Train Time, I thought, I wonder who else is doing podcasts about trains. And I came across a recording that Gareth had done with an American, I believe, to talk about how there were really stupid flights in the U.S. that could be much better done by trains. I thought that was interesting. But then I discovered that Gareth has very recently published the book about how essentially trains are our future and why. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you ended up, taking this on.
Yeah, so that episode, I'm glad you found that episode. So that episode with Tom Paine is a friend of mine. It's very good fun. He and I have collaborated on other podcasts, and he's often on. So I spent a lot of time and was recently a brief period of being a co-host on Well, There's Your Problem podcast, which is a fab podcast. Tom is also on it. So we know each other through that podcast. Recorded the fun episode about short flights, or not even short flights, but kind of flights that by any sensible metric really ought to be trains, and that's good fun. That's Rail Natter is that podcast. That's my podcast, and I've had it for 5 years, pretty much nowish. Actually, as we're recording, it's been around for 5 years, 250 plus episodes. But that has before I did that podcast, I was doing writing. But my background, my day job, my living and breathing is as a railway engineer. Now, for your listeners, that's engineer in the civil engineer, sort of mechanical engineer sense, rather than engineer as in train driver. So I am an engineer as in a railway engineer, a maintenance of way engineer, right of way engineer, and the UK, a permanent way engineer. And I'm an engineer in the traditional sense, in that rather than just being I'm a consulting design engineer, but in the traditional sense, I'm an engineer in that I don't just do my engineering, get up in the morning, do a 9 to 5 of consultancy work at a computer, then go home. I see engineering in a bit more of what engineering was 150 years ago, which is telling everyone about why I'm doing what I'm doing, explaining the kind of the science, the engineering, but also the kind of the political context and the social context for why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I think it's important. And having done that through talking, lecturing, writing, but kind of short pieces, I was asked to write a book putting all of that into a giant melting pot, a giant cauldron of my book, How the Railways Will Fix the Future. So that's kind of the story of how it got to, I've been doing this for, I've been an engineer for over a decade. I've been writing for 5 years, 6, 7 years actually now. And the book is a culmination of all of that. And it's not, as ever, you realize that, there's more. I've got more thoughts, but it was a perfect snapshot of all of my thoughts up to about a year and a half ago when I kind of pulled it all together. So,
And how will railways fix the future? Obviously you have a different story in the UK, but you obviously also know quite a bit about the US. So tell us how that's going to work, what we can do, because we're trying to figure out here.
Yeah, spanner somewhat thrown in the works, given that you have someone who's very much against trains, very, very high up and powerful in government. Yeah. But so the book really talks about the fact that railways, across the world, we have lots of challenges that are pretty existential. Carbon emissions is a key one for which most of the world, most of the developed world, transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions now, largest sectoral source. But we also have other crises like mineral dependency, loneliness, aging population, overall resource uses, land use, stretching across, the US might be a big country, but even you guys have, challenges in what land you can use and your ability to use land where you have, for example, good access to water as an absolutely critical resource, particularly over on the West. The limited access to water is a key limitation in what the development looks like for your friends over in California, for example. So, all these different challenges that come together alongside the epidemic of road deaths, by the way, which, 30,000, I think, deaths in the US a year, 30,000 deaths and serious injuries in the UK. Huge numbers of people, including children, are killed on our roads every year. That's totally unacceptable. If it was any other source of death, other than perhaps, firearms, then there would be huge amounts of action to reverse this. But because it's one of these things, a bit like firearms in the US, actually, that's considered a God-given right, rather than something that we decided was a good idea only 100 or so years ago, or 200, 100 years ago in the case of the car, that we decided, let's absolutely tear our fabric of our society apart to prioritize this form of very individualized movement. All of these things, that individualized movement is the source of a lot of these problems that we've got. Greenhouse gas emissions, loneliness, the built environment conflicting with the kind of the wild environment, and so on and so on. Impacts on indigenous populations, impacts on children, and the minerals requiring slave labor or child labor to be got for the future of cars, which is electric vehicles. So all these challenges interweave. And we have a solution, we have a technology that we understand very well that tackles a lot of these things, much higher capacities than roads, much lower resource requirements, and much safer, much, much safer. And they're called trains, they're railways. And so the book is about the fact the railways, it explains this story and how the railways, we know the answer to improving to solving all these problems. It doesn't need to be some new magical technology invented by the tech industry. No, we know we have the technological solutions. The challenge is influencing them politically. And in explaining how the railways can solve these problems, what I also do is kind of explain how railways in and of themselves are a bit of a microcosm to understand the bigger, wider world as well, understand politics, understand how systems can be optimized.
Right, yeah. Just as a system. If you were to summarize the technology that rails were, and what is it that makes them special, distinct, and useful, efficient?
Well, for not giving an answer that's generically engineering, actually, it's a principle called the principle of load transfer, which is basically a fancy way of saying, because of the way we designed the infrastructure, so that's the tracks and everything below, and because of the way we designed the train, specifically steel wheel, steel rail, we have an incredibly low friction at that interface.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you can move many, many more people and things, load for much less energy, and therefore much less mineral requirements, much less material resource requirements. And that's the key. It's that energy efficiency of the steel wheel on the steel rail that is, frankly, unbeatable. It's the most efficient way of moving any mass on land. It's short of using a bicycle. For large masses, there is nothing that will beat that energy efficiency.
Yeah. So let's talk. So that's iron or steel. Let's talk about minerals, and let's talk about, I see that you bring up a number of issues related to cars, one being safety, one being just volume, but also the tires, and of course high friction, but that has its own problems. But minerals have been, as our current president calls it, raw minerals rather than rare minerals, but
I won't do an impersonation, although I've been having to do too many recently. It's not that kind of podcast. No, yeah. So there are the number of minerals we use as a species has kind of diversified sort of century on century, and that's not necessarily all bad. We've these minerals have allowed us to do new and exciting things and emancipate more people. But there are downsides to us building a high mineral and indeed high complexity mineral society. And a good example of that are minerals like lithium and cobalt that are now critical elements in the creation of batteries and in battery technology. Lithium is a mineral that requires huge huge absorption of water in the process of drying it and creating the lithium. You look to the Atacama salt flats in Chile, and they're visible from space. These enormous kind of drying lakes, these kind of drying lakes to get lithium. And that absorbs a huge amount of water in the process and has kind of dewatered lots of kind of adjacent indigenous farms and people's livelihoods. They've living like that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and having their ways of life completely destroyed, their irrigation systems destroyed by this water absorbing. So that's one example of lithium being a real challenge. My wife is Serbian. Serbia is currently undergoing enormous political turmoil, partly as a result of a railway station disaster, partly as a result of, related to that, a massive lithium mine being opened by Rio Tinto and exploiting, essentially with absolutely no limitation, no regulation. So this is a really hot topic, and this is across the world, right? It's a serious challenge in sourcing lithium. It's not that we should stop lithium, right? Lithium is a mineral that has the potential to sustainably provide jobs and sustain the economies of countries that haven't previously had their own mineral resource. That's fine so long as they get ownership of it, rather than us in the global north, if you like, basically stamping in there and doing colonialism 2.0. So that's lithium, one serious challenge. But we should minimize our lithium usage, right? If we're going to use lithium, we should use it as efficiently as possible. We should not be using it for very, very heavy cars. The Hummers and things should not be electrified. We should be making our cars smaller, much, much smaller, much lighter, and therefore making most use of lithium where we can if we need cars. If not, ideally, we'd be using public transport for moving people and goods around that doesn't require lithium at all. So we don't need lithium to move things around carbon free. We have other solutions. So that's lithium. Cobalt is another key mineral, and cobalt is involved in the creation of lots of different types of batteries. And a huge majority of it comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which itself relies on child labor. So all of the lithium in my phone, in your phone, in this laptop, in everything, all of it includes lithium that has been diluted through the entire supply chain, because unfortunately it all goes to one supplier, then distributes back out. So all that cobalt is mined by child labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, unavoidably, and that is just not acceptable in the 21st century. So we need to find better ways, and by there being this gold rush, if you like, to these minerals to create better batteries, because the car is seen as the future by so many policymakers, because they don't have to tell people to change their behavior. It's seen as perfect, and also there are a lot of vested interest in keeping cars king. Well, frankly, we're not going to have a planet to live on if we do that, and not just from a carbon emissions perspective, but it's really unacceptable from a whole species perspective.
I'm so glad. I've been beating this drum for a while, so I'm glad to.
Yeah,
I wanted you to say that, because it is true. It is a hard message for people, perhaps Americans more than anyone else, but the Chinese are buying cars like crazy too, while building train lines, and to make a switch. I mean, that seems to me the big challenge here is that a majority of Americans have probably never ridden a train at all.
I can tell you that for a fact. The average distance driven by taken train by someone in the US is like almost the lowest in the world. Like in terms of the countries for which I have data on per capita travel, that number for passengers is absolutely tiny. It's a tiny number. The distance it's spectacular.
Because many parts of the country there are no passenger trains.
It's decimated after the Second World War. Absolutely decimated.
So if you've never been on a train, and most Americans have never traveled abroad either, so they haven't had a chance to ride a train. It's people who have gone to Europe or Asia or even Africa and ridden a train, and they go, "Oh, this is interesting. This is actually quite nice."
Yeah.
So it's that is a challenge for people, because they can't. If you say that cars are a problem, they don't have an emotional connection to anything else.
Yep.
And that's something that we're trying to do. But one of the things that we have been talking about here in my little bit of the country is putting in some battery-powered electric trains on a short line so people would have a chance to ride it here in this rural area. But you brought up, in just what I've read of your work, even the issue with batteries and electric trains. There's a lot of talk amongst the train folks here about electrification, the cost of electrification, and then the issue of, batteries. But you brought up, again, it's getting the highest return on the resources that you use. And,
absolutely, yeah.
And that's where trains are good. But I had not thought about electrification in terms of overhead lines. And it would be useful to us, I think, to hear your thoughts on electrification of rail in general.
I mean, it's an enormous story, but the electrification of railways, we've electrified railways with either overhead wires or kind of rails, electrified rails down at kind of ground level for a century more. We've had electrified passenger railways for a century. The US started it. The US was first in having these, because of the tunnels on the in and around. Some of the first electrified tunnels were, around Philly and Baltimore. The various railways around there were pioneering this stuff, and then kind of dropped the ball a little bit on it as we moved into. There are various reasons for that, but the aversion to capital investment of the class ones now is a serious threat to sustainability of the railways. And so overhead electrification. The reason why overhead electrification is so good, and this is summarizing an enormous story, but the reason it's so good is because you are fundamentally taking the power source, which is the same as a proper power station. The energy a train absorbs, particularly a fast train or a freight train, it's as much as a power station sat on the ground. So having a train carry around a power station is not very efficient. Take the power station out, make it a real power station, part of the generating grid. You take a huge amount of weight out of the train and allow it to be, and that means that, so whether that's a diesel generator or whether it's fuel cells for hydrogen, which is a very bad way to power trains, or whether it's the weight of batteries, taking that out and just putting the electricity into the wires and then having a pantograph that picks it up on the top of the train, makes your train lighter, much more reliable. It makes it faster. It can accelerate more quickly and brake more quickly, and therefore you can fit more trains onto a given stretch of track. It's much cleaner than the diesel alternatives, of course, but also, it's much less mineral resource intensive than battery trains. So it's all round the right thing. And there are situations where, electrification is perceived, overhead electrification is perceived as being costly. Now, there are a couple of factors at play there. Firstly, only over a very short time span is that true, because very quickly the return, within for a decade's timeline or even shorter than that, overhead electrification will almost always be cheaper. So as soon as you're looking at the timeline of the assets you're buying rather than a shareholder return, electrification is always cheaper. So it's the right thing to do from a cost perspective, let alone all the other things. There are other challenges. The class ones complain that, we can't have double stacked intermodal containers if we have electrification over the top. That's not true. Have a look at India. They currently run lots of double-stacked containers, the largest intermodal containers with electrification, with overhead wires over the top. So it's completely feasible and normal and doable. Yeah, so lots of reasons against it. Electrification just gives you a better railway. That's fundamentally what it's for. It's not so much about getting rid of carbon emissions on the railway. It's about giving you a better railway, which can drive overall carbon emissions reductions because you move people off roads and onto railways.
Let's talk about the equipment. Again, these are technical things that I'm thrilled to have a chance to ask someone about. I noticed in one of the reviews of your book, it mentioned that you had talked about the need to make, to actually manufacture our own railway equipment. And that's a big issue in the States because I don't, right. So you know far more about this than I, so please.
Yeah, building. So let's talk about trains. So there's all sorts of other kit, and this kind of applies to that kit as well. So whether it's signaling equipment, so the equipment that controls where trains are and making sure they don't bump into each other, whether it's electrification equipment, whether it's the track and that kit. Okay, fine, but let's talk about trains because trains are a particularly unique problem in the US. The US has basically gutted its own domestic train manufacturing capabilities, just completely destroyed them, whether it's locomotives, whether it's rolling stock, whether it's multiple units. So, decimated it. And why did it decimate it? Well, a variety of reasons, but the consequence of regulation that is, because of the mixed traffic and the heavy freight and a railroad system that is very oriented towards freight, the FRA, the Federal Railroad Administration, has made regulation very, very, let's say, bafflingly conservative on rolling stock. So how heavy rolling stock has to be.
Yeah.
But also, there were two companies that built huge numbers of coaches pretty efficiently at scale, which was Budd Company and the Pullman Railroad Company, Pullman Car Company. Two companies that, ironically enough, those went bust, and then a load of new companies that were that existed in the rest of the world, whether they're Japanese, whether they're European, Brazilian, were building the same licensed Budd cars or Pullman cars, but at much greater cost, because they build a factory, they build a couple of contracts worth of trains, and then they disappear again. Yeah. And part of that is the Build American legislation. So Buy American, Build American legislation that's a bit of a counterintuitively ends up with less getting built in the US overall, rather than just allowing some trains to be procured off the shelf from, say, Europe or Japan or elsewhere. So you end up in a situation where you have less being built in the US as a result of the Buy American legislation. And of course, the domestic railroad car manufacturing industry has been decimated by a mixture of federal legislation that favored aviation and car, protectionism, tariffs, all this stuff, but also the lack of investment in local transport systems and in national transport systems. You had a situation where Amtrak, it kind of conversely, very sensibly consolidated its fleet. When it was formed, it consolidated its huge, complicated, mixed fleet of rail cars, consolidated those, and ended up getting rid of the oldest ones, which meant that those oldest ones then cascaded to where there were rail lines opening or being used. And that meant that there was just not really a huge demand for new rail cars. Similar stories happened in the UK in terms of demand for rail vehicles. But in the US, it was particularly chronic, and that killed the domestic industry stone dead. And at that point, then, whenever any new train orders came along, they were for an international company that would come, build a factory, build a couple of orders, and then leave again, which is obviously inefficient,
very
to say the least.
Yeah.
Because not to mention hugely disruptive, bad for jobs, bad for workers, so on.
Yeah. Every time I talk to someone about a proposed new rail line, and all over the country, there are places that say, well, we want to restore trains. There's lots of little initiatives, medium-sized initiatives, quite apart from the high-speed folks. But it's always then the equipment is going to be not just expensive, but we're not going to be able to get anything for years.
And so Buy American means that you have to build a factory before you can buy the trains. And that's even if you're a short line that just wants like one multiple unit. Yeah. No one's building one multiple unit because those factories don't exist. So what you should be able to do is buy those trains from Stadler in Switzerland, place the order, and those trains would arrive on a boat. And hey presto, you've not paid to build a factory. All you've done is paid for the trains off the shelf. For small order, okay, for large orders, I could understand there being some level of protectionism required. That's quite reasonable. I can understand that. But strategically, for small orders, small train orders, down up to like city level orders, short of completely renewing all the fleet of the New York subway or whatever, small orders should be able to go to manufacturers elsewhere and buy the trains off the shelf as they are. And that includes updating and modernizing the FRA's regulations as well to allow that to happen, to allow that to work.
Yeah. What would it take to switch some of the car manufacturing capacity in the United States to train manufacture?
Ooh, a very interesting question. The challenge is that it is... the skilled, so machines, equipment, processes, manufacturing lines, that's all stuff you can change quickly. It's about skills and people is the thing that takes time. Processes, skills, and people. And auto manufacturing is a high skill environment. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I think if it was as part of a long-term strategy, something that the US always pretends it doesn't have, but absolutely does, part of a long-term strategy, then I would say building the skills and indeed transferring the skills of those people from road cars to rail cars, if you like, is absolutely possible. Yes, the physical factories are very different. A rail car is a long, big object, and it involves, but that stuff, it's easy to throw up, particularly in the US where warehouses for Amazon are going up left, right, and center, no problem. It's easy to build those lines. The factories are very straightforward. It's the skilled people that take time. And if you're importing and then growing existing processes and then you build in the skilled labor from the auto industry, that's certainly a practical approach. And it's one that I think Europe and the UK, for example, need to pivot towards as well, because we rely very heavily on the automotive industry. Europe is currently desperately trying to work out how to save its car industry, just as the US is, because China's won that battle. They've won that battle. They moved to EVs. They threw trillions of dollar equivalent at developing batteries, and therefore they have the best batteries by far. And their cars are cheap, much cheaper than those in UK, Europe, and the US. Europe and the US have also gone for bigger cars, which are off-putting for most people because you can't afford them. Yeah. So for me, when I transfer to an electric car, the only cars that are even remotely close to the kind of car I want are Chinese, are BYD, are MG, which is a Chinese company, even though it uses an old British brand. So we've lost that battle. So perhaps we should think about transfer it rather than going, well, then I suppose we have to let the auto industry die. No, that's a huge number of skilled people. Transfer them to doing something useful, perhaps.
Absolutely. If I were the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, that's what I would be doing. That's a logical, rational, humane,
Rust Belt jobs, serious opportunity to turn around places that have suffered with the auto industry contracting its, productivity improvements or technology improvements that have sacked a load of people. Well, railways, the good thing about railway cars is that there's only so much you can automate in creating something that's that large and kind of it's a good source of jobs, and it's sustainable. To talk about sustainable creation of jobs for sustainable transport, this is good stuff. It's a virtuous circle, which is what I talk about in the book. Once you start doing this stuff right, it's a virtuous circle rather than the downward spiral that we're currently locked in. And the thing I talk about is the downward spiral is tied to the political situation. The populism, the increasing right wing views are coming from this downward spiral. Everything feeds into everything else. If you want to spin that on its head, this virtuous cycle comes from governments making some bold strategic decisions, and that can be led from a city level, because if you show what the art of the possible is at a city level, at a state level, in the US, you've got the benefit of very powerful states. At the state level, suddenly it starts, the art of the good, the art of the possible. People in states without trains start going, that looks good and I want that, and it's next door to me and I can see that it's good.
Yes.
It doesn't have to, it's not a situation where we have to magically rely on some new wonderful president or some reformed Democratic Party coming back in. No, this can be done at state level.
Yeah. I would like to talk to you a bit about the freight passenger rail situation here, because I gather that we have a lot more freight trains than that are used in Europe, and this conflict, a legal conflict, a practical conflict, is really a factor. And then I think we should talk a little bit. You brought up loneliness a couple of times. I want to talk about that in terms of this, the social effect of public transport or individual cars. So how about those for two very divergent topics? But I think that will be really relevant and interesting to the people listening. Yeah, freight. What do you think about freight trains?
Yeah, so freight, the railways originally were created to move freight around. In fact, as long as we have been an industrialized species, railways have existed and we have moved freight around with them. The first railways were popping up in the 1400s, if not before. And we only don't have records of them before because
I didn't know that.
Records are bad. Yeah, railways are not 200 years old.
No,
Darlington.
Like by you.
Sorry, Stockton, Darlington. You're not the first railway. No, the things that we would absolutely recognize as railway have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. Things that are definitely a railway with trains moving on them have been around since kind of the very early 1800s. Mm-hmm. But we've had railways. Trains and railways aren't one and the same. Trains have existed for 220, 230 years, but railways have existed for hundreds of years, so that technology, that low friction technology, and so making the most of, whether it's horse haulage or rope haulage or whatever it happens to be. So in terms of freight, the US, there's a couple of things at play. Firstly, that the Class 1 railroads have too much power. And to be honest, there's whether you extremely heavily regulate them or you just nationalize them, their kind of fate is sealed, because they are, as companies, they are essentially, their whole business model is destroy ourselves, get rid of all of our business because we're chasing an operating ratio that is meaningless and requires us to destroy the thing that sustains our business model. So they are doomed, whether it happens in 5 years, whether it happens in 10 years. The fact is that no one will work for them in a decade if nothing has changed, because everyone will have left for stress and changed to a different industry. Mm-hmm. The last president, Amtrak Joe, broke a strike that would have potentially resulted in positive change on the railroads, and instead, Wall Street stepped in, and the Class 1's got to just keep everything much as it is today. So they're doomed. In terms of freight specifically, the US is interesting because there is this grand view that the US railway might be rubbish for passengers at large, but it's the world's best freight railway. It's not. It is not. On a per capita basis, the US railroads rank behind Kazakhstan, they rank behind China, they rank behind Russia in terms of the per capita goods moved, which, maybe that's considered to be, what did I say earlier? I said, yes, they rank behind, not China, but Australia. Sorry, Australia carries an addition, 3 or 4 times more freight per capita than the US does, which is quite interesting, right? It's kind of, in fact, the US and Ukraine are pretty similar in terms of per capita freight hauled, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, that's because the US has a very big population. So once you normalize by population, the numbers start looking less spectacular. And of course, that any benefit to having, that's still huge numbers. That doesn't do it. The US railroad system is fantastic at moving freight. Don't get me wrong. But the system is only because it is entirely sacrificing passenger capabilities to achieve it. Other countries carry that much more freight. It's worth saying that my Russian data is pre-Ukrainian invasion. Sadly, the Russian government has absolutely obliterated its frankly fantastic railway system since its blunders to sustain its dictator. But Russia manages to have both a very good passenger and very good freight railroad system. Other countries that have both. Ukraine has a very good freight and passenger railroad system. There are lots of countries that do both, that achieve both. Switzerland and Austria have spectacularly good railroad systems that carry, Austria carries an enormous amount of freight per capita, less than the US, but it also carries a huge number of passengers per capita. So, in terms of the kilometers that every individual on average travels by rail, it's a huge number, 1,500 kilometers. So, the best part of 1,000 miles, every person in Switzerland, in Austria travels. In fact, that number in Switzerland is spectacular. It's nearly like 2,500 kilometers each. So what is that? 1,800, 1,700 miles
these are small
a year.
Countries.
They're little countries, and everyone's traveling like the best part of 2,000 miles a year by rail. So it just shows how much, So it's just, it's absolutely spectacular. So freight has to be, have the right railroad system. You look at Japan, there's the opposite situation. Japan has a spectacularly well-used passenger railway system, but its freight is non-existent. There's basically none. There isn't any. So they're carrying. They have the highest amount of per capita rail ridership. Yeah, over 3,500 kilometers a year. So what is that? 2,000 miles a year. Huge number, but no freight. Therefore, the success of that railway system overall to reduce carbon emissions and do all the other stuff, it's just not quite there. You need a balanced system, and the US is, of course, an extremis in the other direction, where there's almost so what did I said? Japan there 3,500 kilometers. Forgive me for using kilometers. The US
please
98 kilometers per capita. That's 98. So that is, give you an idea of that's it's a tiny fraction. 98 versus 3,554 for Japan. So, you compare even the US to the UK, right? The US 98, the UK 1,200. So it's still like a tiny fraction of a country with equally bizarre politics. So it's a strange situation. So conscious of we've got loneliness to talk about momentarily, but freight is very important. There's lots of things we have to do to get freight right. But the reality is we know how to get railways right. We know how to get freight right. The US does a lot of really good stuff, but it shouldn't be at the expense of other railways, traffic, basically passengers, long distance and commuting and regional railways.
Because one of the great things we have here is we actually do have existing railroads.
Yep.
That they're still there, the right-of-way is there. Because if you have to have new right-of-way, if you have to carve a new line.
Costs very, very, absolutely.
Even the legal issues involved, and the cost makes it, not impossible, but I mean, for a lot of projects, it just, it knocks them out of the running. So there are all these freight lines all over, going to places that people often want to travel. So, but we don't have a good model for restoring passenger service on those lines. I hear about there are projects all over the country. That's what people want. And we don't have, the legal wherewithal and just the strategy for it, even though it's clearly possible. I mean,
and you're strategizing in a box, as I say, nationalization of the class ones is the likely long-term inevitability. Like that's kind of an inevitability, because what will happen is you'll have the railroads, the class ones, are on their way to another Penn Central kind of failure, and so that's another collapse. And what happened last time? Well, you got Conrail. Conrail was extremely successful, actually, by its own merits. Yes, it did get rid of a lot of railway, but actually Conrail is a very successful operation, and that kind of is where we're going to go back to. But then the balance needs to be, unlike seeing the two as separate, Conrail could have subsidized Amtrak if the federal government had their head in order. They'd have kind of laid things out more strategically in that way. That's the situation we need to be in. But also the priority of traffic, in terms of just saying everything is freight, we don't care about passengers. That just cannot continue, because it results in something we might talk about a bit now. It results in a lot of isolation for communities. It results in huge amounts of the country and huge amounts of the population, of an aging population, by the way, being increasingly isolated from itself and others. And what does that isolation breed? Paranoia, populism, bad things.
Yeah. Where does it come? Because I'm writing a book about third places. So all the social gathering places and hangouts that have, that we need and that we don't have enough of. But transportation has come up. I've had a couple graduate students, one in the UK, one or two in the US, who've been in touch with me because they've said, well, how does public transportation fit into that equation of third places? And it once you start thinking about it, about thinking about the way we design our towns, our cities, and the way we move between them, and the connections we feel with other people and other places and other kind of ways of looking at the world too that one gets from travel. But where does this come up? How have you approached this in your book?
So I talk a lot. Actually, I talk a lot about the way I talk a bit about permeability and about the fact that the railways, but just public transport in general, like the railways are, what the railways enable is not just that everyone travels by train. They enable us to build a form of mobility, a mobility system across our society that allows more people to walk and cycle and wheel and move around in those ways. It's because if you deprioritize road traffic, you improve those things. And the way that people should be getting to their third places, is not by train. It's by foot or by bike or maybe by bus or by tram. But like those, train is what you do to go to work maybe, or what you go to travel and see family, friends, go to leisure, go and holiday, whatever it happens to be. But the railway, building a good railway system, by pulling the long distance traffic, the regional traffic onto the railways, you free up more space on local networks for more local amenity travel, whether that's local businesses, of course, who do need the roads, or whether it's local people able to travel by bus more reliably because there's more space for buses, or most critically, particularly in the US, you win back public realm from multi-lane highways that go through the center of your towns and cities, and indeed your villages, So that's a really key thing, because when I've been to the US once before, and my adventures were pretty much Philadelphia oriented. And even in Philadelphia, which is one of the most walkable, one of the more walkable cities in the US, still an incredibly car oriented city. relative to other places. And you know, Center City is a classic US gridiron city. But even out in some of the areas, you know, up by the zoo is very, very car oriented. You know, how on earth you actually get to the zoo without using a car, I do not even know. Yeah, I think there's probably a trackless trolley or you know, so on and so on. But the point is that, you know, if you move society's mobility away from the car, you win back space, and therefore you can create much healthier, happier, and more accessible communities.
Healthier and just much more interaction. I'm thinking as you speak that, of course, one of the big problems with cars is that people go from their door to the wherever, and they don't cross paths with other.
You don't pick up that coffee on the way through the station. You don't see the same person who runs the little kiosk that you go through and sort of say hello. You don't have those interactions. You don't say a cheerio to the bus, and the little boost that you get from saying hello or saying those boosts are what they're nourishment. We're a social animal. Without that nourishment, we become ill. Like, I'm not just saying that like as a sort of a quack psychiatrist. We become ill if we do not have that interaction. The car is designed to sterilize us of that interaction. And it provides alternatives to make us feel like we're safe, like increasingly heavy armored vehicles that are being sold as personal cars. Those are not replacements for the safety, the security, the health, the mental health that you get from interacting with our fellow species, our fellow creatures. And I wanted to kind of, on this point, to be a bit more optimistic at the end of this little point, because I talk more positively about this in the book. So I dedicate this third part of the book. The book's split into 3 parts, in which there are chapters within. The final part has no chapters. It's just one big chunk, and it is painting this positive story about what the railways enable. And so the way I talk about this, creating this space, is I talk about, you know, what communities do you create by getting rid of highways, by getting rid of airports where you don't need them, all these big spaces that you suddenly get back. You create wonderful mixed use communities, and community really is the right word to use. You know, communities that involve, it's not just single zone housing, it's not high density housing, it's not what the YIMBYs necessarily say either. You know, it's about having that mixture of modern light industrial mixes beautifully with residential and with commercial. So getting all that nice mixed use, so people can walk around 15-minute cities, have that space that they can just work, live, play nice nearby without even going anywhere near their car.
This is so relevant to the towns and cities that we're talking about here, and I'm grateful to you. I think this is inspiring for me, and I think it will inspire our listeners very much. And we may come back to you with more, seeing as
please do. Yeah, this was very broad and arm wavy, but there are specifics. The book is a whistle-stop tour, and it covers all sorts. So there's fiddly detail, there's big broad stuff. It's all there.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks for joining me at Train Time. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me your suggestions for future shows, and visit our YouTube channel, Train Campaign, for some great interviews and amazing historical footage, including a bit from the documentary The Last Train to Pittsfield, filmed in 1971.